So let's talk about one of the bloodiest and most costly wars in American history that very few people know about. It's most commonly called King Philip's War, and it's a war that began in Plymouth Colony and ultimately engulfed most of New England in the middle of the 1670s.
Shout to Jehovah, all the earth. Serve ye Jehovah with gladness. Before him come with singing mirth. Know that Jehovah he God is.
Hi, I'm John Turner, professor of religious studies and history at George Mason. I teach and write about the role of religion in American history, particularly interested in evangelicals, Latter-day Saints, and more recently, Pilgrims. The title of my book is They Knew They Were Pilgrims, Plymouth Colony and the Contest for American Liberty. It's a history of the Pilgrims and the colony they founded. And I wanted to write it in part because most Americans know something about the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, and the very beginning of Plymouth Colony, such as the story of the first Thanksgiving. But the colony that these settlers founded endured for another 70 years. And most people pay much less attention to the rest of the story. And I wanted to learn about that, research it, and narrate that longer story of what the Pilgrims established.
'Tis he that made us not we.
Today, I think there are two primary ways that Americans understand the Pilgrims and Plymouth Colony. And these are competing ideas that Americans have been debating for some time. One of them, and this is probably still the most common, is to understand the Pilgrims as a group of saintly religious refugees who came to the New World to establish something akin to the religious liberty that many Americans cherish today. The second alternative viewpoint is that this is part of the English conquest of what they called New England, in which English settlers show up, take native land, and eventually kill or enslave those who resist. Both of these ways of interpreting Plymouth Colony have some roots in historical fact. The Pilgrims did care deeply about liberty. They had a particular understanding of it, which isn't exactly like ours. And they were refugees from religious persecution in England. And they came to establish a colony in which they could practice their version of Protestant Christianity freely. They also did supplant, for the most part, the natives who had lived in the colony that they settled. And ultimately, while the colony began with a treaty and an alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags, that treaty eventually broke down and led to conflict and war. It's important to go back to that early 1620, 1621 interaction between these two peoples and to try to understand both groups as human beings who are trying to make the best of a confusing and difficult situation. And let's start with the natives. Over the previous several years, they had endured an epidemic that was far, far worse than COVID-19. In some parts of southeastern New England, native populations had been reduced by this epidemic by as much as 90%. And when these English settlers that we call the Pilgrims arrive, they found a lot of graves. They found a lot of bones covering the earth. So the native peoples of southeastern New England were in a very difficult and challenging situation, trying to put their communities back together after this plague. The English, for their part, they were strangers in a strange land, that they couldn't readily communicate with the people that they encountered. They were desperately trying to simply survive and worried about defending themselves. And in this particular moment, these two peoples facing what for them were unprecedented challenges had to make a decision whether they would fight each other, whether they would cooperate with each other. And at first they chose to form this difficult and tentative alliance. I don't think either side trusted the other, but they chose to cooperate and work together. It's also worth examining what Americans understand as the first Thanksgiving. This is something that's really more rooted in myth than in history. There was a harvest celebration in the fall of 1621. The English, who had lost about half of their company during their first winter, had a successful harvest in the summer and early fall of 1621. And they decided to take several days to relax, celebrate, and feast. Part of their celebration was firing their guns. And their native allies heard the gunfire, decided to come and see what was going on, and were invited to stay. They also contributed some food for the occasion. And so there was this, joint harvest celebration in the fall of 1621. It wasn't exactly, necessarily our stereotypical image of Thanksgiving. Long tables, English and native people, sitting down for a formal meal together. It's really several days of recreation and feasting, maybe a little bit less explicitly religious than Americans today might imagine. Most Americans, and even most historians, sort of forget about Plymouth Colony after 1621 and that harvest celebration, and they especially tend to ignore it after 1630, when John Winthrop and a much larger group of Puritans show up to Massachusetts Bay. Plymouth is a smaller colony to the south of the Bay Colony. It's always less populated and less prosperous, but it has some really important lessons about early American history to teach us. First of all, the Pilgrims of Plymouth Colony did care very deeply about liberty. The Mayflower Compact, which they reached before they came ashore, established an element of political liberty that the colonists cherished for the next 70 years. They voted in annual elections. They gave the right to participate in colony-wide affairs to a pretty large percentage of male settlers. Certainly not what subsequent generations of Americans would consider maybe robust political liberty, but nevertheless significant to them. It's also important to take a look at the way relations developed between the English settlers and the Wampanoags as the decades passed. At first, it was, an alliance between two peoples facing, really challenging circumstances, and an alliance that benefited both English settlers and natives. But as the English population continued to grow as the decades passed, and the native population either stagnated or declined due to subsequent waves of epidemics, the English found this a much more advantageous situation than their native allies did. They continued to expand their settlements, found ways to acquire native land, sometimes more or less fairly through purchases, but sometimes through means that really weren't fair. They sort of sometimes swindled or sued natives out of their land. And eventually, large numbers of those native peoples decided to push back and resist that English encroachment on their land. That gets us to the part of the story that most Americans aren't familiar with in terms of Plymouth Colony. So let's talk about one of the bloodiest and most costly wars in American history that very few people know about. It's most commonly called King Philip's War, and it's a war that began in Plymouth Colony and ultimately engulfed most of New England in the middle of the 1670s. So half a century after the Mayflower. Those circumstances had placed the native peoples of the colony in, again, very challenging circumstances. The English were encroaching on their land, interfering with their internal affairs. And a number of the native communities in the western part of the colony organized themselves to fight back and resist. What eventually happened turned into a war that began in June of 1675. A Pokanoket leader named Metacom, known to the English as Philip, formed alliances with a number of native communities. And what were first skirmishes between those communities and the English turned into a war that engulfed ultimately most of New England. It was a terribly costly war for both sides. A number of English communities were burned. There were a large number of English casualties. Ultimately, though, the war was devastating, absolutely devastating for many native communities in Plymouth Colony and also in other parts of New England. The English eventually prevailed in the war, largely because they got a lot of help from certain native allies. And they were, at first at least, pretty ruthless and vindictive toward the native peoples they conquered. Within Plymouth Colony, hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 native men, women, and children were enslaved. Some of those were taken outside of the colony and ultimately exported as slaves to places as far away as Spain, Tangiers, and possibly Madagascar. Other native peoples within the colony were reduced to servitude within it. Many of those native communities did survive, but barely, and did so against great odds. I think when we look at the history of Plymouth Colony and we look at the history of early New England more generally, what we see is a story that's both about liberty and also about liberty's stark opposite, slavery. A story in which thousands of English settlers did enjoy unprecedented amounts of political liberty and in some cases religious liberty as well. But also a story in which they reduced other people to servitude and slavery. And those competing themes of liberty and slavery are at the core of what I narrate in They Knew They Were Pilgrims, Plymouth Colony and the Contest for American Liberty. Thanks for watching and learning a little bit about the 70-year history of Plymouth Colony. I'm John Turner, and along with the fall for the book festival. I encourage you to read on.
Bless ye his name.